Just real briefly, I'm going to introduce Ferguson. How many of you are aware of the Michael Brown shooting 10 years ago? Okay. So, it seems like about half of you. So I'm going to kind of begin with a little bit of a discussion about what happened, and then we're each going to talk about, my colleague, Grace Moser, history professor, is going to talk about the history of Ferguson as a sundown town and the historical context, and then Professor Marvin Tobias from psychology, he'll give us his wisdom, and he had great we've done this panel before. The three of us were one of the founding members of the Ferguson panel 10 years ago, and so he's always has some really interesting insights about this issue. So just for those who don't know, a real brief summary. Michael Brown was suspected of, I think, shoplifting. And something happened when he was pulled over, and when Officer Wilson pulled him over and tried to, actually he was walking and accosted him. Some kind of altercation happened. And then Wilson shot Brown. That's about all we know from the evidence we have. There are a whole bunch of contradictory statements. Several witnesses say Brown had his hands up. That's where you get the hands up, don't shoot memes from that. Others say he had his hands up and he stumbled forward, which is why Wilson thought he was being attacked. One witness says Brown moved deliberately in an aggressive manner towards Officer Wilson. We don't know. No one really knows except Officer Wilson, because Michael Brown was killed. That's all we know. There was massive peaceful protest, a lot of anger, a lot of, not just because he was shot, but also because his body was left in the street for a very long time. And very powerful protests that later led to some violence in the evening. When the protests were over, you had, and this is typical, I talk about this in poli-sci, protests are always dangerous. Not because you often bring out some of the more extreme elements. And so peaceful protesters of the day can often feed to people coming in, feeding off that anger, and then becoming violent in the evening. So, as I was saying, no one really knows what happened. But what's interesting is that Black and white Americans have very different, especially then, very different perceptions about what happened. So, given the fact that no one had any clue what happened that day, except for Officer Darren Wilson, there's huge differences. So, if you ask a Black person, African American, was he targeted because of his race? Most said yes, but most white Americans said no. If you ask people, was the killing of Michael Brown justified? Shockingly, or not shockingly, the vast majority of whites said yes, and the vast majority of African Americans said no. Now, what causes this disparity? Why do blacks and whites, even though we know nothing, blacks and whites know nothing about what, we all were equally ignorant, yet we had very different views about what happened. And I argued, 2014, we had our first panel 10 years ago, I argued that the reason for this is because blacks and whites had very different perspectives, very different relationships with the police. For example, this is one of the cool things that Missouri has done, is since late 1990s, every year we have something called traffic stop data, where police report who gets pulled over, who gets searched, and what they find. And in this, every year since 1999, Black people are more likely to be pulled over, and Hispanic people. Black and Hispanic people are more likely to be searched every year. But who's more likely to have drugs in their car? According to the police reports, who's more likely to actually have contraband in their cars? I think it's up there, isn't it? White people, every year. I mean, you go pull up the data every year for 25 years since they've been doing this study. Blacks and Hispanics are pulled over more, yet whites search more, yet whites are more likely to have, contraband in their cars. This is not just a Missouri issue. New York, okay, New York is famous for their stop and frisk in the early 2000s. And again, same numbers. Who got pulled over? Who got stopped more? This is walking while black, so this is not driving while black. Who got stopped more? African Americans and Hispanic. Yet it took, cops were much, much more likely to find illegal contraband, drugs, guns, in white people's persons, on white people, than they were on black people. So what this tells me, as a political scientist, is that for whatever reason, white people, or minorities, blacks and Hispanics, were much more likely to get stopped and harassed by police, even though white people were more likely to be carrying drugs and contraband. So, despite this evidence, and this evidence has been out there for decades, for over a decade really, whites had not, in 2014, did not see a problem with this, okay? They didn't see that there was a problem, that there was a black, they did not support the Black Lives Matter movement. And there was very little support for even peaceful protesters. I don't know if you remember Colin Kaepernick. What happened to him when he kneeled during the national anthem in a football game? He never played football again, right? So peaceful protests, we don't support that. So my argument was that perception shapes conclusions. And since whites have a better experience with police, whites don't get pulled over as much, therefore we had a different perspective.
Uses his knee to pin the man's neck down. I can breathe. Several times during the arrest, the man tells officers that he's struggling to breathe and begs for some relief. Some people who gathered at the scene try to help.
That's good, bro. That's good, bro. Stop me breathing right there, bro.
So, the murder of George Floyd, I think, dramatically changed that. And what I argued 10 years ago was that cameras, now I was thinking of body cameras, but in this case, this was a cell phone footage, dramatically changed that. In 2000, you can see this. You can see that the support for Black Lives Matter gradually increased in the last 10 years or so, but it jumped dramatically after the murder of George Floyd was videotaped and was seen by everybody. And so this perception was shaped because my argument was, and I think it holds true, that the perception change among white people was because we can actually see, we actually realize this is actually happening. This discrimination. Even Donald Trump, this is going to shock you all, even Donald Trump admitted to systemic racism in this country when he was president.
So spoke to President Trump in June following George Floyd's death and amid nationwide protests against police brutality. The president admitted that systemic racism exists. That's something he has repeatedly denied in public.
I don't think there is systematic or institutional racism in this country.
Well, I think there is everywhere. I think probably less here than most places, or less here than many places.
Okay, but is it here in a way that it has an impact on people's lives?
I think it is, and it's unfortunate. believe, but I think it is.
So even, Donald Trump, if the President Donald Trump acknowledged that this is happening, this is real. And so, I had some hope in 2020, 2021 after this, that these cameras have actually improved awareness. That was kind of my goal. Unfortunately, while it did some good, there are still plenty of examples where this is still happening. But because of this awareness, even police themselves now are aware of the issue.
It's in your lap right there. Why did you want to put my hands down? I'm waiting for my hand. But you're not black. Remember, we only kill black people. Yeah, we only kill black people, right? All the videotapes, black people get killed. Yeah.
So, this is a real dramatic shift where I think you now see a lot of wide-ranging expectation that this is real. These concerns are real. So, I'm out of time here. I was optimistic, probably overly optimistic 10 years ago. We could just get white people to realize this is actually happening with cameras. We can solve this issue. Well, not so much. We have less of the perception gap. White people are much more aware of the problem, what's going on. But accountability is still slow and forthcoming. We can talk about that later if we want to have questions about that. There's been a recent backlash against critical race theory, which basically what critical race theory argues is what Donald Trump argued in 2020, that there is systematic racism in our society against minorities. And so even Donald Trump admitted that in 2020. Now you're seeing a big backlash against that kind of approach, unfortunately, in my opinion. So I'm optimistic. We made some changes, we made some progress, but we're not there yet. We're not there yet. I'm used to a touch screen, so I keep trying to touch the screen. It doesn't actually work very well.
Okay, I was going to sit down, but I'll stand up because this is my second presentation for today, and I'm not sitting down. All right, so I did speak about Ferguson 10 years ago, and for those of you who don't know, I actually live in Ferguson, and I was a resident of Ferguson when all of this went down. So for me, it was kind of a weird perspective to have because this was my hometown, and the way that it was being portrayed on the media wasn't my experience. And I felt like, just really exposed. My city, my municipal county is being it's on national news. So it was really strange, also as a history teacher, to really understand it. So I didn't really know what to do for this presentation because, I don't know, like Paul, I kind of share a little bit of cynicism. I think I was much more hopeful then. But it's like with every police shooting of an unarmed civilian, it's just it keeps happening over and over and over. It becomes harder to have this conversation. So I was thinking about what I could do. So I wanted to share some of St. Louis history to kind of put this into context, because this hasn't all been happening since Mike Brown. This has been happening since forever. This is the history of the United States. So I wanted to first share the story that my experience in 2014. I remember it was a Saturday, and I heard from my mom that somebody had been shot and killed by the police. And she called me from the Target parking lot, worried because she's like, I think this is gonna be bad. I was like, no, Mom, it's okay. Police shootings happen. I'm sure there was something going on. I don't think anything bad's gonna happen. And she's like, oh no, Grace, I'm at Target. There are tanks in the parking lot. I said, what? Tanks? And she's like, yeah, there's police military vehicles, like getting ready in the parking lot at Target. Like, I think this is gonna be bad. And I was like, oh man. And I remember the first day was peaceful. It was sad. Like, I remember being really affected by Mike Brown's death because he was 18 years old and he was about to start college. He was about to go to technical school. And I was like, damn, that could be one of my students. And I feel bad for him. Like, he had his whole life ahead of him. And I wasn't really thinking about sort of like the history of injustice or anything. I was just sad. And the news kept playing this image of his mom, like, sobbing. So initially, it was in 2014, it was before I became a parent. And I think I was relating to it as a teacher, feeling sad about my child. But I ended up being pregnant with my twin boys in 2014. So they have, like, the history of this in their whole birth. Like, it was all happening at the same time for me. I was about to become a mother. And something changed that I just relate now to when I hear the story of Tamir Rice or Mike Brown or any of these other mothers that lost their children. She just kept saying, I got him through high school. Like, I got him through high school. Like, that was supposed to be the most difficult thing, to get him to complete high school. And now he's gone. And that just really affected me. I remember that night, they had like a candlelight vigil and all throughout Ferguson, where people just like put a candle on their front porch. And I remember sitting out there with my little scented candle, like I was the only one outside. Nobody on my street had it. But I was just like, I feel like I have to do something. I feel like I have to acknowledge that this person is gone. And there are people who are sad about it. It's nobody should be dead at 18, regardless of what the circumstances are. Nobody should die. And then the next night is when things got violent. There were starting to be, it's funny, like it was like Ferguson was a war zone just on one street, just on one tiny couple 2-block area. And everything else, like when there were people rioting in the street, just a couple blocks over, like on a different street, there were people sitting outside having dinner, drinking wine. Like, it was just really bizarre that it was all happening. And there was this perception that Ferguson was like a war zone because of like how people talked about it in the media. And I got really frustrated because I'm like, no, like this is a legitimate response to a long history of this happening over and over again. So I wanted to share with you just some historical context, right? So Ferguson was a city outside of St. Louis before the city and county separated. So it started off as just like a plantation community. They were like slaveholders in Ferguson. And it was just like a country little retreat. But then in 1875, the city and the county split into two different cities, and this has a lot of impact on St. Louis. It locks St. Louis into a very small boundary, and like, for example, when we see like St. Louis has really high crime rates, it's because we're only factoring in the city, we're not factoring in all the county in those totals. There's actually like much more crime in other cities in the country, but St. Louis, because it's so small and the rates are restricted to such a small population, it makes it seem worse than it is. We're also like high ranking in STDs. I don't know if that's something to be proud of, but it's true. It's also skewed data because we're looking at such a small subsection. And in my last presentation, I did a whole lot of research presenting about like racism and discrimination in the city, from being a slave city, like a city that actually had slavery. I mean, like Dred Scott, like brings his lawsuit in St. Louis to sue for his freedom. I talked about how the break in the city and county was in part influenced because white people didn't want to send their kids to school with black people. And so black people in the city were advocating for public education. And so rather than pay for it, they just split into the county so that the white people could move to the county and go to schools out there. I went and talked in depth about a lot of history, but even going into like white flight in Ferguson, like talked about some of the Ferguson businesses that are out here in St. Charles County. So like I lived through the 90s, 80s and 90s when a lot of white families left Ferguson and came out to St. Charles County for various reasons. But the underlying issue is systemic racism. I don't think that necessarily people said, I gotta move away from Black people. It was just the perception that Black people would bring down property values, that they would bring in crime. If you wanna get a good taste of like what St. Charles people said about Black kids going to school, just listen to was it Francis Howell that bussed in kids from Normandy? Just listen to the public open forums, what people were saying about Black students from Normandy coming to their school. It's not a nice history. But I want now, because like one change that's happened since Ferguson, 2014, is that we have a lot of comprehensive history available to us. There's people who have sat down and analyzed, like, why Ferguson? Why did Ferguson become the center point for 2014 in the Black Lives Matter movement? And last year, this book was published, which I highly recommend. It is The Broken Heart of America by Walter Johnson. He is a Missouri native, and he looked and examined Ferguson through the lens, or just St. Louis, through the lens of something that's called racial capitalism or race capitalism, which talks about the idea that capitalism also plays into racism, that in order for some people to be wealthy, they have to discriminate against others. It's like built into the system, like racism is built into capitalism. And it points to like the issue of slavery. Like slavery is what drove the American economy. Like that is what made like financial institutions like Wall Street extremely wealthy. And they were allowing the exploitation of Black workers in order to make their profit. And then that continues after slavery ends. And we see money invested in businesses and industries. And then those industries discriminate against Black workers and pay them less than white workers. In depressions, it's Black employees who are laid off first. When minimum wage is passed during the Great Depression, like federal minimum wage, where they said you have to pay all workers this wage, businesses fired their Black employees and hired white employees instead. Like Black employees had a higher rate of unemployment during the Great Depression and in any era because of that discrimination that's built into capitalism. But anyways, I really recommend this book. And one of the things that he does is he looks at just the history of racism and discrimination towards Native Americans, but also Indigenous Americans. So he talks about how St. Louis was on the edge of imperialism for the West, and Indian removal like happened, which is why we don't have any Indigenous people living in the state of Missouri on reservations. They were removed to Oklahoma. But he goes through a series of events that really connect to this larger story of Mike Brown as like putting it into context. And one of the things that I found that really stuck out to me was besides just like when I did my presentation 10 years ago, I talked about the East St. Louis 1917 race riot. Really a race massacre, because riot implies that Black people started it. It was two sides just fighting with each other, but it was a race massacre. It was employees, white employees who were trying to get higher wages, and then their employers brought in Black workers because they could pay them less. And so they went after them. We'll come back to questions at the end. I'm sorry?
Did you say 1917?
Yes, 1917. It's actually up there too, the 1917 East St. Louis race riot. So I talked about that and the similarities in the language that people used. I mean, they even talked about a guy being in the street with his hands up and people saying, don't shoot. I mean, there was a lot of parallels between the two, but I think the one that really stuck out to me that I didn't even know about was the one that Walter Johnson shared in 1965, which was the police killing of Melvin Cravens. Melvin Cravens was a 17-year-old who was arrested by the police, and he was shot and killed while handcuffed. And this caused outrage in the Black community, the same way that we saw the Black community respond to Mike Brown. Now, whether or not like somebody had done something wrong, right? I think everybody agrees that you should not be killed while you're handcuffed, that you should not be shot and killed, and that's what Black people were saying. Like, supposedly he was running away. That was the police story. And again, like that's another thing, like we're starting to realize, I think, since Mike Brown, how like facts have been changed and like the fragility of the argument, if you say you were in fear for your life, that pretty much allows like police to use any excuse to take lethal like action. I mean, so I think that's one thing that's changed, but again, this is the same. It's the same thing happening all over again. So it wasn't necessarily about Mike Brown as much as this is a pattern that's been repeated, and we've seen Black activism every time. But these got national attention. Like Mike Brown, George Floyd changed something where it got national attention. As Johnson outlined in his story, he shared a lot about the history of St. Louis and this violence in policing. And this is the experience of Black Americans all throughout history. I think what a lot of people came to terms with was that in 2014, people realized that, oh, Black parents have a completely different conversation with their kids about police than white parents do. And I think if you heard that video that Paul was sharing, this lady was saying, I'm not gonna take my hands off the steering wheel. He's like, you're not Black, why do you care? I'm not gonna shoot you. I think a lot of white parents have now started to be less trusting of police as well. And I don't know if that's like the desired outcome, but I mean, if there's something broken in our system that's making people fear this, now that we have so much evidence of how prolific it is, I don't really think you can make the argument anymore about one bad apple when we have a pattern that's repeated throughout history of this being repeated. So Walter Johnson does get some criticism with his novel, or with his, not novel, his book, his history. There's some historians who don't like it, which I just wanted to acknowledge that. Some people argue that putting St. Louis and the history of St. Louis in the lens of this larger issue with racial capitalism is kind of a restricted lens in which to view St. Louis. It also implies that St. Louis is somehow unique as like the representative or metaphor for the rest of the country. But I think this is true in every American city. Also, I think it's worth noting that racial capitalism was created by someone who was advocating for Marxism, which is, there's a strong anti-communist sentiment in the United States, which then dictates it. But that policy is relatively new. It emerged around the same time as critical race theory. So racial capitalism is a relatively new avenue to criticize something within American system of capitalism. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad lens to view it through. It's just we need to take that into consideration for sure. I think it's a really compelling argument when you look at the systemic way in which African Americans have been discriminated against, and some people profit off it. It's a worthwhile lens to examine and consider. The other reason that people did not like Walter Johnson's book was that he described St. Louis slavery as being uniquely violent. And other historians have said, no, like St. Louis slavery was actually pretty mild in comparison to other parts of the city. But my stance on that is slavery in itself is violent. It is a violent institution. There are no good masters. Like if you are complicit in the system of slavery, you are enacting violence on another person without physically hurting them. To restrict someone from their rights to their own body, to the right to consent to whatever happens to their own body is violent. And to somehow say that if, that the plantation masters in St. Louis tended to not beat their slaves as much as an evidence that slavery was more mild, I think that's pretty subjective and not a really good criticism, because how can you quantify the violence of slavery, like his physical versus mental violence? So what I saw looking back is that there is evidence of change since 2014. I've seen evidence of change. The change in that we see when George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery were killed. They were all killed around the same time. Did you guys know, or are you familiar with Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery? Are you familiar with their stories? So George Floyd, we saw the video of what happened to him, but what happened to Breonna Taylor? Do you guys remember?
the police came into her house wrongfully while she was sleeping and they shot her.
Yeah. Do you know why they came to her house? They came into her house while she was sleeping and they shot and killed her.
Weren't they they were in the wrong house?
They were in the wrong house. So she was just a private citizen sleeping in her own bedroom and they came into her house and shot her and killed her. Ahmaud Arbery, he was just going for a run and a group of white supremacists in a truck chased him and shot him and killed him. Right? It wasn't a police-related killing, but it was also a symptomatic of white supremacy in our system that has carried over into our police forces. Did you guys know that a lot of the police during the civil rights movement that were putting up resistance to Black demonstrators were members of the KKK? There is an element of this white supremacist extremist bias that's historically part of the police. So there's a large culture of distrust among Black Americans for that. So to me, it is not so crazy to be concerned about this being like a disease that's within our policing system. Something that needs to be rooted out. So one of the things that I saw during 2020 was that there was a lot more white Americans who were protesting, out into the streets. Now, it was interracial in Ferguson too, but it was predominantly Black citizens that were out in the streets protesting. But I had friends that were down there protesting and were active in Black Lives Matters. But with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, it was much more accepted. Americans had a better understanding of the experience of Black Americans and were more familiar with it. So I think that that is a positive change. In Ferguson directly, as a result of the shooting of Mike Brown, we've seen an uptick in the number of Black representatives in local government. So this is Ella Jones. She was the first Black female city council member. She chose to run for city council because of the events at Ferguson, because of the way that the city handled it. And she got her seat in 2015. And then in 2020, she tried to run in, I think, 2016 for mayor, but she lost to James Knowles, who was the mayor at the time. And then in 2020, she successfully won the seat and she became our first Black woman elected to mayor position. In addition to this, we've seen other city council members get elected who were also Black. Prior to Ferguson, there were no Black city council members working in city government that were making the policies of over-policing the Ferguson residents. The Department of Justice investigation following Ferguson revealed that Ferguson police officers were pulling over Black people more than white people and giving them tickets. And then if you didn't pay your ticket, you had to pay it 100% up front. And if you didn't pay your ticket, you could be arrested until you paid off your debt. And so then it became a form of debt slavery, where people would lose their jobs because they could not pay. And then if you showed up to the court unable to pay your whole ticket, then you would then be arrested. So people weren't coming to their court dates. And then they were getting all these big fines against them that just became worse. And this was a practice that was present in a lot of municipalities in St. Louis. That's another thing in St. Louis County, we don't have just one police force. We have every single city, and there's a ton of little sub-cities. They all have their own police force. Calverton Park, which neighbors us, is a population, I forgot of how many. They have 16 police officers. And it's a tiny, tiny little position, in between Florissant and Ferguson. I just saw that they finally gave up their police force because once that predatory policing was no longer allowed by the Department of Justice, they lost the income to be able to keep their police force going. But this is what allows, those municipalities is what allows these bad police officers to just get swapped around. So Darren Wilson, the guy who shot Mike Brown, was originally from Jennings, and then he got fired for discrimination. And then Ferguson hired him up. So it's all these cops were just making the rounds in this old system, which hopefully has been reformed a little bit. So just to go back to Ferguson City Council, Black Americans make up 67% today of the population in Ferguson. In 1990, I think they made up 25% of the population, so we've seen a growth in the number of Black residents and white flight to other areas. But they made up 0% of the city council up until 2015. And now we've seen some slip backs. Like for a while it was 50-50, which I thought was more fair. 50% white city council members, 50% Black city council members. Even though if you wanted to be really representative of the neighborhood and the community, it should have been 67% Black city council members and just whatever the difference for white city council members. We've since seen a pushback, multiple years pushbacks from white residents trying to get more control, wrest control away from the Black city council members. Like Ella Jones has been the target of multiple people to try to just run dirty campaigns to try to get her out of office. In the last mayoral election, Nick Kassoff, who's one of the people that just got elected to city council, ousting a Black city council member, and also one of my former students at St. Louis Community College, which is kind of embarrassing. Anyways, his campaign said, blamed Ella for potholes, saying that she refused to fix them. When every freaking municipality in St. Louis was struggling to take care of the roads because of tax dollars. Which, by the way, if you guys notice there's construction everywhere, do you know why there's construction everywhere? Where did that surge of money come from? You guys know? Weed, taxing weed. So all of that marijuana that's now been legal for recreational use is now being taxed. And that's how Ferguson is also fixing their roads. But the shadiness of the campaign was just blatant. And I gotta say, it's gotten me really discouraged because, again, I was so hopeful, after we saw these changes with 2014, with Mike Brown, with 2015, 2020, it seemed like systemically things were changing. But there's backlash. There's backlash within the community. Within the white community of Ferguson, there's still a lot of division. So I don't know if I feel as hopeful anymore. Although I have made it my mission to vote in every municipal election that I can from here on out. That's something that changed with me. And I'll let you guys know, municipal elections are a way that you can make a significant change. You can make a significant difference now. And if you're not registered to vote, the League of Women's Voters is actually doing a voter drive right outside. You can walk out of this room and go register to vote today, and then be able to vote in the next election. And we'll talk about it more, but those municipal elections, the local elections, that's where you can have a huge impact democracy-wise. One other big change that I wanted to note is that Black Lives Matter activists were elected to office. Although this is pretty controversial because one of the Black Lives Matter activists kicked out another Black Lives Matter activist in recent years. And I think it's super shady. Wesley Bell was someone who rose to prominence following the death of Mike Brown, and then he became the county prosecutor, replacing the guy who refused to indict Darren Wilson. Bob McCullough? Yeah, so Wesley Brown got put into that position, but then he did something pretty controversial, which he threw out Cori Bush in the primary. Cori Bush was on the ground protesting during the Black Lives Matter movement, and then rose to prominence as part of the squad in the House of Representatives, along with AOC and some of the other representatives. But she just got ousted in the primary by Wesley Bell, and he had, it connects to some of our later presentations for Democracy Week, because he was largely funded by a pro-Israel super PAC, and then took out Cori Bush, which is hella controversial. So again, we're seeing this backlash. It's like some of the activists are there can be only one, but no, there can be lots of people. It doesn't have to just be one person. And I think it's a shame that we're seeing this pushback. The last thing I wanted to talk to you guys about is, if I could change anything post Mike Brown, if I could teach you anything, it's to reject the violence, non-violence binary for protest. That's a false binary. It's a false binary. It doesn't exist. there are multitudes of ways that people have protested and resisted white supremacy and violence. And violence is legitimate. Like having a violent reaction of self-defense, like that is a legitimate reaction to the type of predatory actions that we've seen white supremacists take. Like peaceful, nonviolent resistance is not the only way to address things. Like for example, the church that accepted Dylan Roof, like peacefully welcomed them into their Bible study. And he sat with them, and then he opened fire on them and killed them all, right? That was nonviolence meeting extreme violence, right? So I wanted to share this book with you as another history outlet. This is by Kelly Carter Jackson. She's a historian in Black history, and she wrote We Refuse, A Forceful History of Black Resistance. And she presents this argument of we should reject this idea that there's only MLK and Martin Luther King. There's a lot of in between, right? And sometimes resistance is just walking away and not engaging. She shares the story of her great-grandmother. Her great-grandma in 1910 was a little girl and stepped on a nail and developed tetanus in a time where antibiotics weren't widely available. And her mother, her great-great-grandmother, took her to the only doctor that was around, which was a white doctor. And he said, yeah, sure, I'll treat you, but you have to agree to be my domestic servant for life. And this was 1910. So this was like 60 years after slavery, 50 years after slavery ended, and he's still trying to get a slave. And the mother was so desperate to get her daughter treatment because tetanus kills you. Like it's a really bad, like bacterial infection. And she almost agreed to the doctor's terms, but her own mother, so this author's great-great-great-grandmother, said, no, you're not going to agree to that. And then she kept her daughter from accepting it, and then she treated her granddaughter with the medicine that was available to her, which was just like herbal type solutions. And her great-grandmother survived, but she walked the rest of her life with a limp. And she said that was a form of resistance. It was just saying, nah, I'm not gonna do that. Walking away, and not as a form of resistance, of doing it myself. Like, I am not going to give in to this. I'm not going to be a part of it. Kelly Carter Jackson has a whole section in her book where she talks about Black joy as being a form of resistance, that we're not gonna let this white supremacy that's like making us miserable get us down. We're still gonna thrive. We're still gonna celebrate Blackness, that is a form of resistance. So I think one of the things that I've observed post Mike Brown is a lot of criticism for protesters, like that's not the right way to protest. Like do what Martin Luther King would do. And then I had to say, well, this is what Martin Luther King did. He's doing exactly what the Black Lives Matters did. And they're like, well, no, that's not what Martin Luther King did. I'm like, yes, it is. It's peaceful, nonviolent resistance. And sometimes maybe it needs more. Like revolutions sometimes are violent. And I'm not advocating for a revolution, but it's understandable, right? I think that we've done ourselves a disservice to talk about self-protection as the violent option. Like self-defense is not violent. It's acceptable in the white community, but it's something that we object to with Black Americans. So if I got too opinionated, I apologize. I just wanted to provide a historical context and give you some other historical perspectives to consider when looking at Black Lives Matter and modern movements, and understand that this has a long history in the United States. Like with like the origins of like police forces coming from slave patrols, of like white people who were deputized to track down runaway slaves, and they could do whatever they wanted to them. And you know, even legal codification where Black people had different punishments than white people. Like it's a huge part of our system. And one of my favorite quotes is by Ida B. Wells, which it was an activist about anti-lynching in America. And she says, the only way to right wrongs, or the way to right wrongs, is to shine the light of truth upon them. So I would like to advocate for you all to educate yourself, to learn some more about the experiences of Black people, to be open-minded to actually like consider the legitimacy of the stories that you're being told to listen. And practice democracy yourself. So one of the big things that we've seen happen since the Black Lives Matter movement is censorship, right? So that's like where the action's coming from. It's trying to ban Black histories in schools. And school board elections are where you can make a big impact. So is it, again, Francis Howe, that following everything, elected a couple years ago some candidates to their school board who were all 100% for banning critical race theory, Black history. When people say they're gonna ban critical race theory, they don't know what they're talking about because nobody's actually teaching critical race theory. That is a like graduate level analysis. What they're really arguing for is not teaching Black history because it will make, they're afraid, the fear is that it will make white students feel bad about themselves. That they'll feel bad about like the way that they profited from privilege in their life. The problem with that though is that I find that it makes students really cynical when they get to my college classroom and we start to discuss Indigenous history and Black history and they're like, why have I never been taught this before? Like what do they think is gonna happen if I learn this? And I don't have the answer for you. I just think that you should challenge it. Like ask questions, push back. Because it's all history. It's not fake news. It's history, right? And everybody deserves to have their story told. It's part of America's story. So again, sorry if I seemed a little bit disillusioned or cynical. I'm going to turn it over to Marvin now. How's that my service dog was up here? He's confused.
Oh, so I don't have a PowerPoint slide.
I'm just going to pull up the democracy goes by.
So I was up here 10 years ago, and I did an entire spiel on just a different perspective coming from psychology. I focused on bias at the time, implicit bias, implicit attitudes that people have. And at the time, I asked people like to think of the name Agnes and what face comes into your mind when you think of Agnes. And no one really comes up with the face of someone Jamaican with locks when they think of the word Agnes. And so my spiel was basically focused on all these images and perceptions that people have are driven, which can impact our thoughts, our emotions, our behaviors, and that can sometimes play a role in the perceptual differences that we have when something like Mike Brown happens. So at that time, I had indicated that when I had heard about it, I was more like, oh, okay, because of my particular experiences in my upbringing, most of my interactions with police officers were different. They were always more negative. And I actually was more positive that after what happened with Mike Brown and different types of protests, that people would start realizing the role that implicit biases and implicit attitudes have on the behaviors that we see. So we know that between 2014 and 2020, there was a whole bunch of research that talked about how people perceive individuals. So we know for a fact that after 2014 to 2020, there was research in the education space. We found that teachers, when they had students, whether they're Black males or white males, they focused more on the Black male students. They identified their behaviors as more aggressive. They're more likely to get in trouble, even if the behaviors are ambiguous. And the unique thing with that research was that it didn't matter if the teachers themselves were Black or white, they still looked at Black students more, they perceived behaviors more negatively. We know that in the medical space between 2014 and 2020, research was done about the types of treatment care that Black patients were receiving. They were less likely to receive medicine because the idea between 2014 and 20 was Black people feel painless, so they don't have to be prescribed pain medication as much, which led to people saying, I need a Black doctor who will actually listen to me. And just as so how implicit bias and attitudes work, which goes back to Professor Moser's point, it didn't really matter if someone is Black or white, they're still receiving the same messaging, they're still receiving the same images that suggest that there's some unique difference with Blackness. There was a research study done that when you show whether someone's white or Black, they show them a neighborhood and then giving them information about the demographics of that neighborhood, is that neighborhood more likely to have crime? And people felt that the darker a neighborhood became, which means the more likely Black people moved in, the more the neighborhood was gonna be more criminal, more broken down, more disorganized. And it didn't matter if the people looking at the videos were white or Black, it was the same idea. That association with Blackness being some type of criminal entity, some type of negativity, because that's the type of images that are being promoted, which means that it doesn't matter technically if someone is white or Black. As a person, they're still receiving the same images. So when people talk about systemic issues or institutional issues, that goes into broadly how we portray and interact with people. Black people will think that if there's more Black people in crime, if there's more Black people in the city, there's gonna be more crime, just like white people do. Between 2014 and 2020, there was a whole bunch of this attitude research, this whole bunch of this bias research done outside of Ohio State University. And so because all this research was like, oh man, we're recognizing that all the things that we're consuming, all the stuff that we're processing, all the things that we're interpreting, we know that it's an issue, so there can be a change. But all that seemed to change, at least on the research side, after George Floyd, because there was this unifying, protest in every state. But from 2020 to 2024, you're seeing less and less about implicit attitudes, implicit biases, how we act and behave, and you're seeing people being more explicit now with their dislikes, more explicit now with their judgments toward different groups of people. So for me, going from 2014 to 2020, and now 20 to 24, there was a progress in recognizing and how I bring in images and how that changes how I think about things, to now I bring in images and it's okay for me to express negativity toward groups of people I have never met in any way, shape, or form. And that's a problem just for me personally. Okay. So, okay. That's loud. So for example, if a person is born in another country and they migrate here, let's just say to a small city outside of Ohio, let's just say Springfield or something. So a person born in another country migrates here. The only difference between me and that other person is the country they were born into and where they actually moved to. There is no other difference between me and that person. It's simply where you were born and where you moved to. But when I start to surround myself with images that if you're not born in this particular country, you are by definition an issue, you're against the fiber of my country, the values of my particular country, it doesn't matter if I explicitly endorse it, I'm still receiving it. So that when someone says something that's bizarre or ridiculous about this other group of people, I'm more likely to accept it. Because I don't challenge the fact that I'm absorbing all this information that says you're gonna destroy, you're gonna devalue, you're gonna be something other than. Because that's how people work. So I have to be careful of the things that I bring in, which are going to impact what I think, what I feel, and what I do. So my only things from 2014 and now is be aware that whatever we bring in is going to change how we think about things. It's going to change how we feel about things, which can change what we actually do. And the biggest way to bridge this gap or to live in this great society that we live in is to be aware of these attitudes that I have so that I can actually start to change the attitudes that I have. Because you gave some books. I'm going to give a couple books that you should read, which give context, and I will tell you if they're objective or not. So the first book you should read to actually get an idea and understanding of how people work is this book called Biased by Jennifer Eberhardt. And our library did have a couple copies of of that book. But it focuses on how we receive information, how we process information, and basically talks about how we combat these negative ideas that we get. And in her book, she does talk about literally, it doesn't matter white or black, we still receive the same ideas. So that's a good book, it's very balanced. The second book is called Locking Up Our Own by James Foreman Jr. And that book talks about the complicated history that black people tend to have when it comes to police. Because there was this idea that in 2020, when the George Floyd happened, that black people all of a sudden wanted to abolish police and we don't want policing. But historically, black people have always supported safe neighborhoods like everybody else. It's just how that might look. But there was this idea that black people want, criminality. It wasn't. Black people have always supported some degree of law and order. This book talks about that. And then the third book is called America on Fire by Elizabeth Hinton. And this goes back into, when we talk about the history, we talk about what happened in Ferguson, or we talk about what happened to George Floyd, that historically in America, there have been hundreds and hundreds of the same types of unrest and uprisings over and over and over again, and it almost always centers, at least for African Americans, on policing. Almost every unrest that involves African Americans as the center involves some type of legal interdiction. That was actually unique because in Ferguson, there was an idea it was going to be a race war, even though it was basically not about another ethnic group. It was about an occupation. But in that book, they talk about tracking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases where literally the same thing in Ferguson had happened, whether it's the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, almost every decade, there was the exact same thing that happened in Ferguson. And my idea is like, what if people knew that ahead of time? They wouldn't have been surprised when it happened again. So again, for me, just be aware of the images and content that evoke bias that can cause you to change what you think, what you feel, and what you do. And that's my 10 minutes.
Great. And we have a runner, I think Lindsay is here. If any questions or comments you want to make? She's in the back, just raise your hand. While she's doing that, my students, don't forget, for extra credit, you need a selfie as well as write a paragraph as well. So just be aware of that.
Does anyone have any questions? I can bring the mic over.
Be down here.
So, since police violence against black people has been a long-standing issue, why would Mike Brown's killing specifically be so widely publicized?
I don't know if we can say what it is specifically about Mike Brown's death that set off everybody. I think part of it was the fact that they left his body in the sun for so long, for hours in the street, and wouldn't let his mother get to him, wouldn't let her say anything to him. I can't imagine. That just seems especially cruel to deny family from getting to them. So I think when I went to the Ferguson discussions, NPR brought in people to create a panel where they could talk to the police officer, the mayor of Ferguson, and have activists sort of question them in a friendly format, what they were really upset about. That's what I heard a lot, was this was a baby. He looks like a man, but we tend to overestimate the age of black children. That's one of our biases against them. But he was a baby, he was a child, legally an adult at 18, but he just graduated high school. And I think a lot of the outrage just came from another police shooting, and then there was just, the police came in there like with tanks ready for a riot. I think that it kind of became a thing because they made it one. That might be my unpopular opinion.
I agree. I think the militarized response was very shocking to a lot of people in the police. You got maybe one more question left if anyone wants to get into a question or comment. Feel free to comment. It's fun about politics is you can always comment about stuff. There's no right opinion.
I personally thought Tamir Rice or Philando Castile, all of those people, Sandra Bland, like, I felt equally as upset by them, like, starting with, like, Trayvon Martin, probably even before then, 2013. That wasn't a police killing, but it was just a boy that was walking from the convenience store to his home, and some, like, community vigilante chases him down and kills him. Like, it's just not, I didn't think that Mike Brown's life was worth more than any of those other, or why that became like the center point, but I don't know, there's just a long, like maybe it was like historically speaking, looking at the buildup from, we had just gotten like the decision to not indict George Zimmerman, to not, he was indicted, but he wasn't found guilty. Wasn't that in July of that year? And then Mike Brown happened in August. So I was like, collectively, you know, like the Black community was just dealing with like trauma after trauma. And it just wasn't right.
Why was there such a big pushback on like defunding the police and whatnot with all of this violence?
A big pushback on what?
Or everyone was saying defund the police, and
yeah, defund the police is not actually defunding the police. That's a misnomer. What it was is we're like putting a lot of money and investment in policing as a response to everything. So maybe we should put money towards like mental health officials who could be first responders instead of the police. For example, in Ferguson, I had a picnic at a pavilion, like I rented one of the pavilions behind my parents' house, and somebody was in the pavilion when I had rented it and reserved it, and the only number I could call for support was the police. The police, like, I called them, and then I like freaked out and I ran to that pavilion to stop the police. I said, please do not show up on this place, but we're still gonna go check it out. I'm like, please do not. So like, maybe our first response should not be the police. Maybe it should be other places, other experts. You know, if we just pump on them with the militarization, like this idea that the police can buy military cast-offs and use it to police its citizens, like that's something we should be concerned about.
And I think that really raised the defund the police was more out of the 2020 George Floyd killing, I think. That was the push, but you're right, it was not a defund the police. It was say, use some of those funds. If you have a mental health crisis, there's been a number of, I can't remember how many crises in the last 10 years.
St. Louis has had multiple.
Where people call, you know, someone says, my son has got a mental health crisis right now, I need someone to come to our house. And the police then kill that person because he's not responding. And, you know, you don't need a cop there, you needed a mental health counselor. So I think that when defend the police it's a terrible name. Politically, it was, from my point of view, dumb thing to call it, you know, but it's a lot simpler than say, redistribute some resources from the police department to mental health services or other social services. You can't say that, and defund the police is a nice slogan, even though it's a terrible, politically toxic thing to say. So I know they're trying to claim Kamala Harris has said defund them. She's never been a part of that movement, but it's a toxic thing, and they're trying to brand her with that because of that. Unless there's anybody else who really wants to
Did
say.
they answer your question, Leah? Okay.
So, well, thank you so much. Don't forget, there's tons of stuff. There's a movie coming up at 1. There's a whole bunch of stuff the whole week. Actually, on Wednesday, the 11:30 session on Wednesday is about one of the persons, the NAACP, Sabrina Looney. She is also one of the parents who filed a lawsuit in the Wentzville School District over the Bluest Eye book. So it should be a really interesting conversation on Wednesday. Have a lovely day.